Good afternoon, everyone.
Got it. All right, well, that's good to know. I'm going to be back here.
I hope that everyone had an opportunity to enjoy some lunch. A lot of people were asking me where did the lunch come from, and I'm happy to say, oh, I'm sorry, are you guys ready? Okay, thanks. I always forget the recording part, which is important. Jam and Crepes was the caterer for this afternoon's lunch, so many thanks to Jam and Crepes for some delicious food. I also wanted to make sure that everyone is aware that this room is T-coil enabled, so if you have a T-coil enabled device, please feel welcome to turn it on at this time. If you'd like to try out the system, we have some headsets that are available on the piano, and someone can help you. It's important to note that for the T-coil system to work, everyone needs to speak into a microphone, so all of our panelists will be speaking into a microphone, and when it's time for Q&A, please wait for the microphone to be brought to you. It just makes it easier for everyone to hear. If now is a great time to either turn off or silence any electronic devices you've brought with you. Today's program was made possible in part with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors, above all, SPIA in New Jersey, an initiative of Princeton University's School of Public and International Affairs, which provided generous funding for our lunch today, the Princeton University's Humanities Council, and Program in Journalism, and finally, Labyrinth Books. My name is Kim Dorman. I serve as the Community Engagement Coordinator for the Princeton Public Library, and it's my honor to introduce this afternoon's second panel, Democratic Societies and Participatory Journalism. I was pleased at lunch to hear that an enthused anticipation about this panel, and to learn that we have a number of journalists in the audience. Shout out to Tap Into Princeton and the College Voice of Mercer County Community College. This panel is focusing on how journalism is a critical resource in a democracy, the ways in which journalists indirectly promote democracy in their work, and the roles that ordinary citizens may take in this area. Given the theme of this forum and this panel, I am grateful that Anastasia Mann generously agreed to moderate this afternoon's panel. You will have had the opportunity to read her bio when you registered for the event. Her experience is broad and deep. Mann has worked for a long time at the intersection of academia and community, so it is no surprise that her expertise and works, both public and private, together with conversations with students, culminated in the foundation of the initiative she founded, Princeton University's School of Public and International Affairs in New Jersey. I am tempted to offer an effervescent glow-up of all the reasons why I'm a huge Stacey Mann fan, but will simply say that one of the running themes of her work and contributions to society is to uplift voices and work continuously to build the infrastructure for a more equitable future. I'm so grateful that she has agreed to moderate this afternoon's panel discussion, Democratic Societies and Participatory Journalism. Please join me in welcoming Anastasia Stacey Mann.
A friend like Kim Dorman. Hello, everyone. Couldn't be more delighted to be here with you today. So grateful to Kim and Cliff and Janie for pulling this together. It's a really the beginning or the second installment in, I think, a really exciting tradition here in our community's living room to gather together and talk about issues that matter, that are of tremendous import to all of us. So really good of you to come out on your Saturday morning to be a part of this. And I love the way that Cliff has set this up so that a good part of the program is hearing from interesting people who have really worked on the front lines of journalism, and also a good part of the program is set up for you all to interact with them, because many of you have interesting, relevant experiences, whether professionally or privately, that will bring further light to this conversation. So both of those parts of this program are really important. As Kim mentioned, I run the program on that is focused on New Jersey at the Public Policy School, which feels to me really relevant to what's happening here, because Princeton University is your neighbor, but also professional home to a lot of people who are thinking about many of the issues we're here to talk about today. And so the idea of SPIA in New Jersey is to make those connections, and that, public policy is not like metaphysics. in the sense that it is an applied science. And so we want to be out meeting the people who are doing the kinds of work all around us that are making change and bringing to light important conversations and things that matter outside the academy and at that intersection. So this panel is thrilling, really three dynamic, diverse talents who bring really different perspectives to the issue of journalism and democracy. And I'm super excited about it. What I'm hoping that we will do is really delve into how journalism relates to power, at least in the sort of moderated conversation that happens next. But first you'll have a chance to hear from all of them on sort of their vantage point on the role of journalism and democracy, and then we'll explore further sort of tensions around traditional sort of legacy journalism versus more upstart community-based journalism. What's happening in this domain? There are a vast number of outlets that exist now that didn't exist when we were children. What are the implications of that? How does that relate to things that are happening in the polity all around us and in society? Like the New Jersey Project, and part of why the New Jersey Project feels relevant at this moment is that where there's so much deadlock all around us, gridlock all around us, closer to home, it feels easier. The characters are more knowable and accessible. So I think we'll do some talking about what the sort of geographic differences of perspective as well. So we'll hear from Jane Ferguson about reporting very far afield from where we are now, and from Tennyson about reporting right in New Jersey. And then Andrew maybe mediates somewhat between those two. Anyway, it's going to be very exciting. So we'll touch on participatory grassroots kinds of projects, and the role of social media, all of which have a lot of import for the way we understand our world, who has power, and I would argue probably all of this is really relevant to the question of public trust, which was raised this morning. So we're going to think about what it means for non-professionals to take up a kind of journalistic practice and take action through journalism in participatory journalism, and then also maybe what further demands we want to make of our journalists, what kinds of stories we want them to tell. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Jane, who's our first panelist. Jane is a Polk, Emmy, and Peabody, as well as 2 other awards I haven't heard of before, but I'm sure are big deals. Foreign correspondent for the PBS NewsHour. She contributes to the New Yorker, and she teaches now in the journalism program at Princeton. She's recently settled in New York after a wide-ranging career all over the place, which she has not hung up, but is allowing herself to be a little bit grounded for the time being. And it's thrilling from a university perspective that our students are getting to encounter Jane and her way of thinking about storytelling. Her memoir, No Ordinary Assignment, was published by HarperCollins just earlier this year, and I read a little bit of it, and it seems very exciting. And Jane, I'll just add, spent a year of one of her formative years at the Lawrenceville School, although she is English-Irish herself. So without further ado, here is Jane.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I am delighted to be here, and as you've heard, I've been a journalist my whole career. Really spent about 15 years living and working in and reporting from the Middle East, and then in the last few years going back there from my base in New York. I grew up in Northern Ireland, so I did grow up in a place where the intersection of news and conflict were very important, where we really depended on the news, and the news was a hugely valued resource to our community, a very divided, very sectarian community. But But I think to do this job, most people ask me why I'm not more pessimistic, but I would say optimism is absolutely needed if you're going to be a war reporter. Perhaps I got some of my optimism from 1998 when we actually managed to negotiate the end of our conflict in Northern Ireland through the Good Friday Agreement, and where we really saw the impact of diplomacy there. But before we go to our panel, where we're going to really be talking about democracy and journalism and where the two kind of intersect and how they've evolved over time, I just have a short period to speak here, so I really thought, rather than give a very long lecture, I just want to introduce two important points that have been very, very prominent in what I've seen out in the world and within the news industry, certainly the sort of global or certainly the Western news industry, in terms of changes and important points on both democracy and journalism over the last sort of 12 to 15 years. So for the first one, I'll give you a little bit of background about me. Growing up in Northern Ireland, since I was about this high, I wanted to be a journalist. I'd turn on the news every evening, and there would be, lo and behold, women reporting the news. I grew up in a very patriarchal place, so the idea that everybody was shushing and being quiet in the evening because there were women speaking was not lost on a little girl like me. So the evening news was, as far as our house was concerned, this was word of God important speaking. I grew up watching on the television the war in the Balkans, the first Gulf War, these huge global events. And of course, when I was a teenager, that was when 9/11 happened as well, and that played out, and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq also played out on our television screens as I went to high school, college, and then on to become a journalist myself. I grew up under the understanding that to become a journalist, what that really meant was to work for an organization, either a newspaper or a TV station or a radio station that was known, that was a big brand in the United States. Traditionally, how you would become a TV reporter was you would get an agent, because they don't take unsolicited approaches, and that agent would filter you through to one of the big three, with the exceptions being cable news, like CNN. The big three would be ABC, CBS, and NBC, of course. And that was basically the only real way to get into national and international reporting. As well as obviously the broadsheets in the major newspapers. I didn't manage to get a job. I got out of college in 2007, and the world's economy had collapsed. It was impossible to find work. All of the graduate programs had been canceled. TV stations were laying off hundreds and hundreds of staff. Newspapers were going bust. So I ended up joining a very young, new generation of freelance journalists. My best friend and I, who ran the student newspaper together in England, she went off to Mexico and started freelancing. She's now the West Africa bureau chief for the New York Times. And I ended up in Yemen and the Middle East, learning Arabic and learning how to somehow navigate the crack that we'd fallen through within the sort of legacy media and TV stations, while Ruth was working in the same way in newspapers. Then the Arab Spring happened. The Arab Spring, of course, the spread of pro-democracy revolutions all across the Middle East, starting in Tunisia, spreading obviously to Egypt, which was probably the most visible protest movement in the region. I covered it in Yemen. Clearly it happened in Syria. I was there in the very, very early days when it was still a protest movement and not yet a war. This spread across the region. This was happening at a time when social media and technology, whether it was hardware, that we were all suddenly all carrying a camera and a video camera in our hands, or it was software that was connecting us, and people were able to access directly a journalist who was standing in the street in Cairo filming the crackdown by the regime's thugs. This changed the face of news. It also came at a time when news organizations did not have the budgets or the resources to cover 5, 6 revolutions going on at the exact same time. They couldn't send teams with satellite trucks and producers and lights and all the gear all flown out from London or New York or DC from the US networks. And so this huge group of freelancers, many of them locals, many of them Arab journalists as well, many of them foreigners, were able to start getting their work in the newspapers as well as in the broadcasting world. That's where I started working with Al Jazeera. I started working with Al Jazeera English in Yemen during the revolution there. They eventually started using me as a reporter who could sneak into places like Syria to cover the conflict there. But what I noticed when working at Al Jazeera, which was the most diverse newsroom I've ever worked in my life, in Doha, they would hire the greatest talents, whether it was the best Pakistani journalists or the best journalists from Kenya. Everybody from the whole world, it seemed, had sort of condensed down into groups of journalists, and they were based in this one enormous newsroom in Doha. They sent me to Afghanistan to become the Kabul-based correspondent. And I was very proud and excited to find that we were the only English language broadcaster based with a bureau in Kabul, where it was entirely staffed by Afghan staff, except for me. So I was working with Afghan cameramen, producers, the engineer was Afghan, absolutely everybody in the newsroom. Unlike many of the other broadcasters that were there, from the BBC to NBC and CBS. But what I really was witnessing at that time was what was to become a really natural part of the future. The technology and the software, as well as the fact that people were able to directly access these journalists anyway. And increasingly, so we're seeing this now, and in the future we will continue to see this, is that local journalists can access you. They can talk directly to you. They do it through social media. Look at, for instance, the situation in Gaza right now. There are no foreign journalists in Gaza. There are only Gazan journalists. Many of these are men and women who have already worked for the big three and the major newspapers for years and years as stringers, as contributors, as fixers, as producers. Now they talk to you directly. They talk to anybody they want directly. In my experience in legacy media, covering some of the biggest stories in the world, and right up until today, freelancing as well, working as a freelancer between these worlds, it's very clear which one is growing and which one is declining. I'm on TV, and I don't own a TV. So I in many ways kind of embody that. So that's one thing I would say about democracy and news, and what we're really starting to see in the green shoots going forward of local reporters as well as international reporters, but journalists who are more and more likely to be self-employed, traveling, and able to reach people directly. The second thing I just wanted to leave ahead of the panel discussion is that those very, very early days of my career, with the Arab Spring happening, so much conversation was had around democracy and the idea that Arab countries and Arab populations, especially the young populations, were rising up because they wanted Western-style democracy. It's not entirely wrong to say that they wanted democracy, but what they really wanted, what was a more accurate description, and this comes down to reporting done by those who had lived and worked in the Arab street versus those who were sort of flying in and had more of an American lens, an idea of, well, okay, what's the geopolitical, what's the structural changes they're asking for? What they were really asking for was the results of democratic institutions, more democratic culture within the centers of power in their countries. Mohammed Bouazizi, he was the spark that started the Arab Spring, was the young street fruit vendor in Tunisia, who self-immolated after being told he could no longer sell fruit in the street. He clearly hadn't paid whatever bribe was necessary in a deeply, deeply corrupt society. A police officer turned over his cart, confiscated his scales, probably the only thing of any value that he owned, and humiliated him, made it impossible for him to make a living that day. He showed up at the local sort of municipality centre the next day to ask to lobby for his scales back. Unsuccessful, no one would see him. It's hard to describe how little power this person had. And he stood outside and he poured gasoline over himself. And he said one thing before he lit the match. He said, "How do you expect me to make a living?" That's what he said. He didn't say, "We want a Western-style democracy." Now, whenever you spend a lot of time as people got more organized and they got more thoughtful in how they were essentially expressing what it is that they wanted in many of the countries that rose up, we started hearing discussions of democracy. But more often than not, we heard things like, we want to be able to live without corruption. We don't want to be harassed by corrupt police. We want to be able to find a job. We want to be able to afford to live. Essentially, dignity. People were asking for a sense of dignity. So in so much of my work, whenever we talk, we view things from a very, very Western lens. And we look at geopolitical trends and we look at political structures. Very often, I'm asked in America about what kind of democracy people want, but when I'm in the street, in many places that I am, like Afghanistan, instead what I hear is the quality of life that people want. And they're aware that more accountable democratic institutions will provide that for them, but it's the personalization of what that actually means for them that matters most. And I'll just leave you with one example of that. In Afghanistan, the government in Afghanistan was technically democratic. Afghanistan had some of the greatest legal minds of the world pour in to build and write a new constitution that wove in many of the conventions of Afghan culture, but also democratic rights and freedoms. Women were protected legally under the constitution, but Afghanistan was such an example of how we can't just come in and basically create a framework without actually making sure that it works for people on the ground. That the reality for the average person is the result of the democratic institutions working. And the dignity is ultimately the goal here. It's not just elections. So with that, I will leave you with a million talking points to start our conversations on from. But thank you so much for having me here today.
Ferguson, that was fantastic. I now have the image of the fruit vendor self-immolating in my head alongside, we heard about this morning, the young African-American girls in the U.S. South who demanded access to U.S. public schools, and women in ancient Rome who poisoned the unaccountable heads of that society. So I think we're pulling a thread through about the voices of the voiceless. Our next speaker is Andrew Rodriguez Calderon, who is a computational journalist at the Marshall Project. Andrew is also an adjunct professor at the New School in New York City. So we're pulling in regional talents here. Andrew teaches data, design, and community engagement, and additionally works as project and product designer for the Journalism and Design Lab. This is a nonprofit initiative to develop civic infrastructure through free journalism and design training at community colleges. Let's hear it for community colleges. That's fantastic. Okay, so let's hear it again.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for having me here. Tough act to follow, I have to say. I'm so inspired by everything that you said. My mind is kind of reeling, I'm sure yours is too. So I just want to ground us a little bit and take some inspiration from how you introduced yourself, because I think part of the one of the undercurrents of what I hope that we're going to talk about when we enter the panel discussion is how important it is to recognize that not only the humanity of the sources that we're working with and the people that we're covering, but also the humanity of the journalists who are actually out in the field or at their desks, as many people are, covering issues. And so I'll tell you a little bit about myself. So the Marshall, actually I'll preamble to say that although I work with the Marshall Project and Journalism and Design, what I'm going to express to you today are my personal views and experience. Should I move close? Oh,
No,
thank
this way
you.
you want
Good
to go.
idea, thanks. And so I'll just say that so my family immigrated to the US from Colombia, both of my parents, about 36 years ago. My mother is formally incarcerated. I was born while she was in handcuffs. I myself am queer. I'm married to a man. And there was a time when all of those things had to be left at the door of the newsroom because of the fear of maybe being perceived as bias in the work that I do. I now work in a newsroom that covers the criminal justice system. And it's so important to have journalists who understand the experiences of the people that they're covering to be able to really go deeper, right? But this also can sometimes challenge the 20th century paradigm of what journalism is supposed to look like: objectivity, neutrality. And in the work that I aspire to do and that I try to do, I try to emphasize that it is possible to be a journalist and cover communities that you are a part of while still being independent and being factual and providing reliable information. So I'll say that from the journalist side. From the practice side, the work that I do is deeply based in a few different design paradigms. One of them is collaborative design. I also draw inspiration from design justice as well as designing from the margins. Essentially what all of that jargon means is that I believe that to be able to truly do impactful journalism, what you have to do is to work with the people who are affected by the issues that you are covering and ask them to participate in the design and development process of a story or a news product. And we often talk about the fact that for a large part of the 20th century and part of the 21st century, and still today, but I think this is shifting, newsrooms would talk about people rather than to people. I want to take it a step further. Can we talk with people? What does it mean to bring someone into the conversation, to share whatever power you have as a newsroom, to empower communities to be able to participate in the journalism making process and helping them commit acts of journalism. And so I had a presentation, I'm not sure, but maybe it's not worth bringing it up because I don't want to take up too much time either, so we have time for the panel discussion. But I'll just say, I don't know if, okay, go for it. Oh, okay, should I just pop down here? Oh, I see it. So I'll just give you an example of what this looks like. I'll go through it really quickly because I want to leave time for Tennyson to be able to talk to us as well. But I'll just say that an example of what this looks like, just a use case, is for the past year I've been covering book censorship inside of prisons. And what we did was that we filed FOIAs across the country to be able to get banned book lists from every single Department of Corrections, as well as policies that are used by the Department of Corrections in each state to be able to decide what people are allowed to read and what people are not allowed to read. This at a time where nationally book censorship is a really hot topic because of what's happening inside of public schools and education systems in many parts of the country. And so I'll just expand this really quickly. And so what I started doing was by looking at the kind of context and the history of book censorship, but then I started talking to people who are working with people who are incarcerated to get access to books and asking them, what do you need to be able to do your work? What do you need to be able to hold a system accountable? I spoke with prison educators, I spoke with books to prison programs, I spoke with the formerly incarcerated as well as their loved ones who often struggle to be able to send books into prisons, and was able to publish a series of stories and tools. And so one of the tools that we published was a searchable database of all of the banned books that have been banned inside of each Department of Correction so that people could look at them. What was interesting was that when we first published them, the reporter that I was working with believed that families of the incarcerated would be able to use these lists to decide what they could send to their loved ones before they did so that they could not waste time and money on postage in a community that's historically under-resourced. And that was wrong. When we actually started talking to people, they told us the system is in flux all the time. The decisions are so arbitrary. Even if you give us a list today, it may not be true tomorrow. This actually doesn't help anyone to make decisions about what to send in and what not to send in. We wouldn't have known that if we hadn't done what we did, which was show them what we wanted to do, tell them what we thought they could do with it, to have them tell us you're wrong. That's not it. But what they were able to do was to get a historical sense of what systems were banning in prisons. And that was helpful because then you can trace that to different political moments, etc. So then through these conversations, what we were told was, you know what we could really use? Policies. If you could make the policies intelligible to us and actionable, that would really help us, because then we can go back to the system and say, well, in Alabama and in Arkansas and in New York, they're doing this. Why don't you have an appeals process? Because everyone else does. But you can only do that if you can systematically compare policies. And if you're not a legal expert, that's really hard. If you have a low reading level, that's really hard. So what we did was that we compiled all of the policies and we ran them through ChatGPT, through a series of prompts, to be able to render them, render summaries that give you a sense of what was inside of the policies. We then went back to people and said, is this what you wanted? And they said, that's cool, but actually we really need to be able to compare them. So can you go a little bit deeper? And so we did. And so we kept prompting and kept working, and we were finally able to come up with these summaries, which had the same categories across the board. So public sources, publication sources, publication specifications, review and approval system, so that you could compare them across every single policy and then had summaries of what the policies say about every single one. And so I just wanted to share this use case with you to give you a sense of all of that jargon and all those terms, what that looks like in practice. And now we've had people tell us that it's been extremely useful to them and that they've been using it in their work. They've been talking to their state agencies about their policies. And all of this is an example of collaborative design. I have Rosalia up here. I don't know how many of you know Rosalia. She's a very famous Spanish author, and the reason why I think she's actually a great inspiration for the perspective that I'm trying to share with you is because she's traditionally trained as a flamenco dancer. And many people who are used to doing journalism, who are much older than I am, will sometimes hear what I'm saying and they'll say, well, isn't that just advocacy? And we'll have more conversation about this, I believe, but what I like about Rosalia is that she's someone who's trained traditionally but isn't afraid to innovate without forgetting where she comes from. And I think that there are ways that we can do this work without losing a sense of traditional journalistic principles, but while at the same time innovating and pushing things further. And so just some of the key components of what I'm saying, if you take anything away, Rosalia will help me. You have to listen to people, you have to design, then you co-design, you design with them, and then you iterate. And you keep going until you have something, be it a story or a product, that everyone feels good about and that meets people's needs. And that's it. And if you're interested to read more about this, I wrote about it in this post that's called Decoding Bureaucracy. You can find it on Google, and you can feel free to send me an email if you're interested. Thank you.
Don't everybody be Googling Rosalia while we're still sitting at home. That was great. Thank you so much. It is my abundant pleasure to introduce Tennyson Danier, who is my friend and also one of the inaugural fellows at SPIA in New Jersey this year. That's the program at the School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton. Tennyson is a seasoned journalist. He's a storyteller. He's an aspiring filmmaker. He has been working in and around New Jersey's media landscape for some time. He studied at Temple University media studies and production, and also spent time at the Entrepreneurial Journalism Creators Program at CUNY's Newmark's Graduate School of Journalism. Tennyson has reported from Maine to California. I have personally seen video of Tennyson reporting in the middle of some kind of weather incident, a blizzard, and doing yeoman's work, but he's also upfront and on the ground in communities talking to people about the developments around them that are affecting their lives so dramatically. So in 2021, Tennyson founded Black in Jersey, which you can see his merch he's wearing today, with the aim, shameless plug, absolutely, with the aim to provide a more accurate representation of Black communities and address pertinent issues in the fight for Black liberation. He hails from Washington, D.C., and he's been here in Jersey for 4 years, and he's currently based in Trenton. And we're so excited to have him at SPIA this year, and we're delighted to have him here today.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Felt like I was just hearing my life flash before my eyes. I don't usually give speeches. I don't usually do public speaking. I'm more of, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, speak up a little bit? Okay, see, that's the thing. Okay. Yeah, so I kind of got into journalism because I was a quiet kid who liked to just be in the backdrop and document. And it actually, my career has actually helped me to be able to communicate better. It's helped me to be able to speak to people from different backgrounds, different communities who may have different values, but I'm able to communicate and hear them out as well as tell their stories, I think fairly and accurately. So I want to talk, well, first I want to get a pulse for the room. So I'm curious how many journalists we have here today, by show of hands. Okay. How many news consumers? Folks who are, okay, a lot of folks in the room. So, Jane talked a bit about the shift that social media has created in journalism. It's really, we've had conglomeration, as she spoke about, the big three. We've had media conglomeration, which has kind of gobbled up a lot of local, hyper-local reporting. And so, now we're seeing gaps being filled through social media, and folks are able to, report on the ground for themselves. That has posed a lot of potential, but also some challenges and things that we should be aware of. And it's my belief that no longer can we just sit back and rely on legacy media or just media in general, mainstream media to inform us. We have to be informed on the process of news gathering, as well as media literacy, media and information literacy. And there are also opportunities, again, if you're interested in journalism, but you don't necessarily want to go the route of working for a major publication, or you want to stay in your community, this is a great time to do that. So I'm not going to go into my background too much. I've worked in TV, digital, radio, and in college we learned about a philosophy, the medium is the message. And so, there's a different way of gathering news in television, in print, in digital, and radio. And they all impact how the end user or the viewer or the listener, as well as the journalist, is engaging in their work. When I worked in television, there was more emphasis on, live TV hits, right? So, I wasn't able to work on as many fleshed out investigations because they needed me on the news at 4:30, 5 o'clock. Sometimes to tell you the same exact thing I told you an hour before, but that's just how the revenue works in television, right? Like it's advertising and it's commercials and it's ads. Whereas radio, television, there's also limitations because of you have to have video for everything that you're reporting on. So, sometimes town hall meetings, there are important issues happening, but no one wants to sit and watch a room full of people just kind of sitting around. And so, your news director might say, I don't want you to cover this important story because ratings, right? People are going to turn the channel. Same thing for radio. And you also have to think about the fact that a lot of folks are listening in their car. So you have to kind of spoon feed information. So you can't really go deep into numbers or statistics and things like that. So same thing with, I think, social media is changing the game. The message for me at this point, and I think the message that we can take from where we are in this age is that, again, we are involved in this process. So I want to talk about how New Jersey's leading the way. Oh, yes. So New Jersey's leading the way in civic information, filling the void that conglomerates have gobbled up, news gaps. And there's also, I don't know if anyone's familiar with the new information literacy law that was signed this year. So Governor Murphy signed a law that requires K through 12 schools to teach information literacy. And I actually wrote down a few of the things that this course will be teaching. So this is bipartisan legislation, widespread support between Republicans and Democrats who have seen the discourse on social media, the misinformation that's proliferated, especially during election time. There was a lot of talk about how we cover candidates and how we cover candidates just using rhetoric or saying things that aren't true. Like, how do we, as journalists, fact check in real time? So it's at the end of the day, we have to teach each other how to basically understand how to see through the rhetoric, to see the issues, to form your opinions. So the course teaches the research process, how information is created, produced, critical thinking skills, using information and resources, research methods, the difference between primary sources, secondary sources, hearsay, what can you know and what can't you know, how to show evidence, difference between facts, point of view, and opinions, etc. So this is great for students, right? For kids who are in school. But what about adults? What about, people who are, actually voting? And so that's where the Civic Information Consortium comes in. There's a law in 2018 that created the Civic Information Consortium. It's a nonprofit that funds independent journalism programs as well as newsrooms, independent newsrooms. And Black in Jersey actually received funding from the second round of the second round of funding, which we have been using to collaborate and with citizens journalists, and we've created some fellowships and partnered with the Center for Cooperative Media at Montclair State to teach people how to take ownership of the stories in their communities. So I want to get back to, I wanted to ask how many people in the room get their news from social media? Actually, that was one of the first questions, like primarily speaking. What do you think of the quality of the news that you see on social media? Do you fact check the information? Go.
It really does depend on the source, so you really have to check what is the source and what expertise they have in the information they are giving you.
Yeah, so there's actually research at MIT that shows that fake news spreads 10 times faster than reputable sources, which, I've seen it on my feeds. Sometimes it's family members, and I don't know if I should say that. I don't know if I want to alienate anyone. So how do we have those conversations? I think that media literacy is becoming more and more important. I think that it's something that we don't think about, but it's a skill, and people move based on the information that they have, and if fake news is spreading rapidly, that means that there's the chance that people are making choices based on misinformation. Half of U.S. adults get their news from social media. You've seen Twitter or X now provide context and community notes, but there's not a lot of tools out there to, in real time, let you know this is probably not something you want to trust. You know, we saw that with COVID. Facebook and YouTube started to include disclaimers and things like that, but you know, it's one of those things where I think we have to teach people. You know, I think we need to invest into community journalism solutions. I think we need to invest in citizen journalism. Because I think the onus is on the people at this point. Newsrooms can't be in every neighborhood, and I hear all the time that communities aren't being covered, or we didn't know that, you know, there was a meeting about something that's going to impact our taxes, or something that's going to impact the education. I want to get into some of the pros and cons of social media age and journalism. Actually wrote some of these down, but any of you, can you think of any pros and cons of social media? Sure.
So one of the issues is citizens don't enjoy the same protections, First Amendment protections. First Amendment protections are from the government, not on private platforms. And what we're seeing now with what's happening in Gaza is censorship, where a lot of what's being put up is being taken down depending on what side of the conflict it lands.
Yeah.
So there is a lot of censoring going on right now.
Sure. And I've heard of different pages being shadow banned.
Mm-hmm.
So it may not be that your posts are being taken down, but the algorithm is deprioritizing you know, the information. And Facebook, which also owns Instagram as well as Threads, has come out and said that it's deprioritizing news. So that makes it hard. So as journalists in this social media first, there are a lot of blogs, community blogs, there are a lot of newsrooms that have gotten onto social media, but the engagement is not there because it's being deprioritized in the algorithm. You know, in terms of marketing the content or your brand, Facebook really doesn't allow you to do that for news coverage for the most part. Mark Zuckerberg has said that people on those apps don't really want to see news. They want to see updates from family and memes and things like that, which, you know, I think there's place for that, but I think you know, with more and more people, again, kind of turning off the television or not owning TVs, not having cable, cutting the cord, they're getting a lot of their news from social media. You had your hand up.
Hi, Elijah Park, my first year community colleges. The simple idea for a pro, closer. Hi, the simple pro would be like that availability to just basic access. I know you said like a lot of cable is being shut down, so it is some people's it's their only way to get news through those social media. So in that way, it could be a pro, just because more people are going to have more eyes on it.
Yeah.
Even though like those newspapers are not getting as many views as they would like to get, they still have the availability to use it, even though if it's not that marketable. It's still a way to get the proper news.
Yeah, the accessibility. That's actually one of the first pros that I wrote down. Social media platforms provide instant access to news from around the world. You know, I think I get asked all the time, like, should we focus more on like hyper-local content, or like, should we as a community just be focused on what's going on in our backyards? And the reality is we're seeing this global community unfold. We're seeing a lot of what's going on in the Middle East. We're seeing, you know, social media was showing a lot of the war coverage in Ukraine, like on the ground. It was making that real for a whole generation of people who may have only seen curated images, you know, censored images on the news. Now you're getting real time. You get diverse perspectives. So social media enables the dissemination of a wide range of viewpoints, including those not typically covered by mainstream media. This can provide a more holistic understanding of news events. Public engagement, it encourages active participation, engagement with news. Users can comment, share, and discuss news stories, fostering a more interactive and engaged public discourse. And it empowers citizens journalism. Again, we're seeing a lot of blogs pop up. Some of the danger to that, or the downside, is a lot of these folks aren't trained. And they're calling themselves journalists, and I don't like to gatekeep that term. But I do see a lot of bad practices or things that I would not do professionally. So, you know, one of the things that I want people to leave here with is just thinking about how can we empower those folks who have a passion to, you know, report on what's going on in their community, to fill the gaps that have been left by conglomeration, and you know, without, again, alienating folks and gatekeeping, but also making sure that the information is reputable, it's fair, and it's balanced. So thank you for your time. I don't want to go over too much. I think we're going to have a panel now.
In my introduction of Tennyson, I think that he was, until recently, the State House reporter for WHYY. So that is a familiar legacy brand to many of you. So when Tennyson talks about the legacy versus community contrast, he's really experienced both, had played an active part in both dimensions of that. My impulse here is to pick up just where you left off, though, Tennyson, in that distinction between legacy and its there are benefits and liabilities to that mode of media, but there's a lot of exciting stuff happening at the grassroots. So I guess my question, which I would love to put to you first, Jane, and then give you, Andrew, a chance to respond to, is what's at stake here? What are the possibilities that are exciting, and what are there liabilities? And maybe you can give us some specific examples. That would be terrific.
Sure. Thank you. I'm not sure. And can everybody hear me? I'll just do a...
It's not
No?
that.
No? All right, I'm going to have to speak up a little bit more.
Oh, is it green?
Yeah.
It's green now, so you
Hey!
can thank you for that. I think this is probably the most fundamental question right now. You know, whether you want legacy journalism to remain, or you want everybody to be, you know, freelancers out and about. The reality is that we're now at a place where even legacy media is laying off staff and making them freelance anyway. Like, journalism is now, so much of it is a gig economy in many ways. So I think that there are so many benefits to this. We've cracked open the sort of quiet behind the scenes of what, certainly in TV, journalism used to look like, where we were reliant on an incredible number of local reporters when we were abroad. I still am, you know, and I work in Afghanistan. I'm lucky enough to work with an amazing team of local journalists. And I think that it's, you know, pushing them front and center is incredibly valuable. You know, editorially, obviously it adds, you know, more expertise than you could possibly, you know, dream of. It also adds a lot more authenticity to the reporting. You know, from a pure business perspective, it makes total sense. You know, we're no longer needing business models where, you know, we need to pay an anchor $12 million to read off a teleprompter, you know, and often read off something that was written by someone else. So you know, this all makes a lot of sense. But I would caution, you know, and I agree that we don't like to feel like we're gatekeepers, certainly in terms of, you know, of the feeling that you're shutting people out of journalism shouldn't be there. Like, the opportunity to become a journalist should become more and more open. That should be as open as possible, especially, you know, when it comes to diversity in the newsroom and class. You know, reporting on issues that you yourself actually have some experience with is, you know, absolutely central. However, there has to be a level of professionalism. You know, I mean, we can't, if we don't have a sense of what it is to be a journalist as opposed to be an activist, then
our work opens itself up to even more criticism, and the criticism could be valid. And so I do think that there's a real need to draw a line in the sand between those who are reporting the story and those who view themselves as an activist pushing for a specific change, as opposed to pushing for the ability to lift up voices of other people, which is essentially the foundations of what quality journalism should be. If we don't have that, then we're all just screaming into a void of Twitter. We're all just part of a very, very loud crowd of people shouting at once. I do think that there has to be a level of professionalism and expertise in how stories are told that adds credibility, that actually is the service. The service is not what you're saying, the service is the professionalism you bring to how it is said. And everything else should really move on from that place.
That's super interesting. I'm interested in the distinction between expertise and experience. In academia, I think they're shrinking a little bit, but I'd be curious to hear from you, Andrew, about how you see this.
Sure. Well, there are a couple of things. So I'll just go back to the social media question and then perhaps circle back to the activism, journalism, professionalism distinction. So for the social media, I was just having a conversation with a colleague who lives in Canada. She's a journalist there, and she told, I didn't know this was happening, but apparently the legislature there, and I may get the terms wrong because I know the parliamentary system. I was going to say the legislature was basically wanted to charge social media companies, Google, Facebook, etc., to publish news. And so in advance of that passing, all these companies said, well, we're just not going to allow you to post links anymore if you're a news organization or if anything looks like news. And so now the news industry there is suffering because they don't have access to that information ecosystem, which really highlights the peril of relying on social media companies and tech companies to be essentially to be the information ecosystem. And so that's the diagnostic, like a diagnostic kind of analysis. I think a prognosis is that at the same time, if we recognize that people are sharing and consuming information differently, then we should be empowering them to make information themselves. We should be empowering them to gather, to verify, and to distribute information locally, and also to think beyond the confines of the internet to be able to share information. People come to the library all the time. It could be an information hub if it positions itself that way. People rely on, I don't know this library, but like in Cleveland, for example, where the Marshall Project is doing a lot of reporting, people rely on the library not just to pick up books. They rely on it for social services. They rely on it as a community center to meet with people. It is a point of intersection. And so finding more of those and allowing those spaces to become information hubs, I think, is a way of extricating the information, like the power that tech companies have over the way that we share and consume information and putting it back into the hands of people who actually need that information. Then you get into the really fascinating, conversation and controversy around, well, what does it mean to allow people to produce journalism on their own without proper training, et cetera. I think, again, like an answer to that in a journalism design, this is what we do, is to train people like a journalist. And it doesn't mean you have to become a journalist. It doesn't mean you have to look for, because, honestly, like, if you're trying to make money, you should not go into journalism. But to be able to produce information and to be able to verify it and vet it for your community whenever you feel like something is important, that's something that we all can do. So I think that news organizations have to think differently beyond the 20th century about how, and really understand how people are sharing and consuming information to meet this challenge. Otherwise, one day, this probably won't happen in the US, but who knows, because it's such a big consumer market. But Google could say, you can't share news anymore because it's not profitable for us. They did it in Canada, why can't they do it here?
That's a fascinating prospect.
Sounds dystopian.
It is, and we're living it.
Do you want a last word on that?
I feel like that was the last word. I'm not as optimistic. I'm gonna be real with you. I think, I've seen a lot of research about like Gen Z, and I'm not technically Gen Z, but I'm like a couple years away. And when it comes to news and when it comes to the political issues, even democracy, there's not a lot of hope right now because in a way we're being inundated on social media with everything that's going on in the world. And it's like, what can we really do to, if governments can just unilaterally make decisions like that, if companies like Google, if companies like Instagram, Facebook, Twitter can say we're going to deprioritize news, it really, it's making the process less democratic at the end of the day, because where do people go at that point?
I think that's really, you're right, that is making it less democratic. I would argue, and maybe I'm just being too much of a dreamer here, but those are companies. They're not necessarily the future of tech. Like, for instance, technology in and of itself could be the answer here. Like you're saying, not looking at for 20th century solutions. But take, for instance, if you do want to truly democratize news reporting, and so, okay, there'll be some gatekeeping because people have to have been trained in like what is, sourcing and verification. But if young people these days are getting their news on their phones, then all we really need to do is figure out a way to monetize the information that people are giving. Like for instance, if you're a journalist in Gaza right now, you might be getting a day rate from a news organization that has hired you temporarily per day to risk your life and limb in the most literal way possible to go out and get video images of the war. And what we're seeing is that they're also putting out their iPhone videos. They're making Mark Zuckerberg even richer.
Yeah.
What we need are like local people, the information that you're talking about, like local news as well. This is valuable. It's actually valuable. And professional journalists, as well as those who are sort of filling the space of citizen journalists, they're putting this stuff out there for free for Elon Musk to make money out of it. And so I think technology could be the answer if those journalists had a place to go, and where that could be monetized, and they could find a way to actually get paid, because that is work. That is information, and it has value. And so the answer won't be traditional media. It will be a new tech-forward answer. And that's something that I think is an opportunity and a necessary one.
I noted your use when you described being a kid and watching on the television your relatives rapped at the image of the women telling the news and referring it to as the word of God. And it's exciting. It's an exciting prospect to think of just regular people out in the world, emanating the word of God. I like that. I'm an atheist, but I still like it. So I guess what I wonder if you all want to comment on, though, is what are the channels? How are regular people going to hold power to account? I mean, journalists have a hard enough time. Or maybe how are journalists, how have you, give us an instance when you have held power to account, what that's felt like, what the pushback was like, because that does seem to be a crucial function of journalism in a democracy, and one, for example, that's under attack here in New Jersey, where there are a group of legislators, Cliff and I recently learned, a group of legislators in Trenton who are trying to pare back our Open Public Records Act. Here in New Jersey, we have pretty much the strongest Open Public Records Act in New Jersey, and there are a group of lawmakers who would like that not to be the case. So, and you should all look that up and write letters about it if it concerns you as it concerns me. So anyway, tell us about a time that you've held power to account, and what you think the prospects of that are going forward. As we have the least qualified Congress that we've had since World War II, according to many people. That might not have been on my notes.
Yeah, I'm trying to think about specific examples.
Do you want me to jump in with that?
Yeah, anyone.
Or do you
We'll
want
do
me
a
to
Q&A
jump in
for
on
sure.
the-
Oh, sure, yeah.
So this is kind of and it's to make a point, but it's going to be kind of a microscopic one. But last year I was reporting with a few of my colleagues on voter reenfranchisement in Colorado specifically, and a mother of somebody who had just been released came to us and said, I went to a bunch of DMVs to try to, with the information packet that the reentry officer gave to my son, to try to figure out how to register him to vote, because it's really important to me that he do that. And they told me that if he does that, he could go back to jail. And is that true? And then we went and looked, and it wasn't. But all of the DMV forms in the reentry packets said that it was. So that meant that potentially thousands of people were not registering to vote when they have the right to do so. And so that was a direct tip from her. We started reporting on it, and eventually it led to us interrogating the voter, I can't remember the term exactly, let's just say like the voter rights office there. And they actually changed the form in advance of the story coming out, and we were able to. What also happened, which was the most exciting thing for me, was that she was we had her picture in the story, her son, and she allowed us to do so. She was very proud of herself and what she had accomplished, and the thought of maybe helping a lot of other people and other mothers like who are trying to help their sons, re-enter society after a really traumatizing experience, was that she was like, I'm gonna tell everybody I know about this. And I'm going to let them know that that their sons can vote. She was a part of a community of people, Facebooks, etc. So she became a font of information through our reporting, and in that way was able to share in the accountability process, but with a theory of change that is more bottom-up than it is top-down. And I emphasize that point because in many newsrooms, and in the newsroom that I work in, although this is changing, the notion of impact is often, well, you need to get a law changed, or you need to get other news organizations to write about this, or you need to get advocates excited about this. And so for me, and in the work that I've been doing, one of the exciting notions is like, how can we help everyday people hold the system accountable? And part of it has been involving them in that process so that they have the information that they can go and share with everybody else they know, because they have a network too. And so that's just one example. I don't know how that scales, and I feel like maybe I might be repeating myself. I'm like banging a drum here. I'm sorry, I'll get off of my soapbox. But just to say, I don't know how that scales, but it's interesting, and I feel like it has potential.
It also goes to democracy is local as well as it's global. So that was an instance right in your backyard, and you helped that person to actually make a cast a vote, right? What's more fundamental to democracy than that? That's great.
Yeah, I'll jump in. So I think no matter the shift in technology, the mediums, the old school tenets of journalism, and showing up where your public officials are going to be, that's never going to go away, right? So when I think about my time in the State House, there have been many times where, I have a story that I'm working on. I remember doing a story on reparations, a bill in the State House about a task force to study reparations, and I've called around to different aides to get someone to go on the record in the State House, whether that be party leadership, whether that just be folks who are involved in the bill. And the sponsors always want to talk about their bill, but when there's something that, when there's pushback, or when you see a bill that continues to come up that people are talking about outside of the State House, but is not, it's not getting into a committee hearing, it's not being voted on the floor, there's pushback, and usually that's party leadership, and it's a well-oiled machine. Covering state politics is you're just getting press releases, crafted statements. So sometimes you have to just show up to them if they're not ready. I tell people this all the time, and maybe I should just go on social media and say this every day until someone hears me. But you can literally the First Amendment, this is the only profession, right, or one of the only professions, that is in the Constitution. It is your legal right as a citizen. You can go into the State House with a camera in New Jersey, unlike PA. You can go into the State House with audio equipment. You can let any lawmaker, you know, they can hide in their offices until it's time to go vote. And like, that's usually how I get them to comment. And they're usually thrown off. You know, they like to be prepared, right? Like they like their aides to be there to like feed them information or to kind of coach them. But that's how you get to the truth of what your lawmakers or what your legislators or your mayor, city council person really feels about issues. Like it's not going to be, you know, the soundbite that you hear them prepared, you know, behind the podium. It's almost like what I would consider, well, what they might consider guerrilla journalism, but it's really just doing the job. It's the people's house. I've literally just had to walk up to them, you know, and anyone can do that.
Give us
So-
an example, Jane, of your having done that.
Or the doorstepping, or I remember, yeah, I guess that's pretty amazing that you can, I didn't know that you can just sort of go in with any citizen can go in, and it's kind of great to think of. Accountability in war reporting tends to be, broad strokes tends to be one of two things. You know, on the one hand, there's what you would think of. You know, official says no civilian casualties in this airstrike. We go there, turns out that's not true. That happens all the time. More often than that, however, a big part of what we do, especially in feature reporting, is actually taking what is essentially not an untruth, but very much so a sort of spin, and actually going in on the ground and telling stories about what it's truly like to live through these experiences, and to film and hold a camera up to the reality of the situation. So Joe Biden is ending the war in Afghanistan. We're bringing the troops home and it's going great. You know, on the ground in Kabul, you know, August 20th, say, 2021, people are dying in the crush. You know, maybe 70,000 battlefield allies and Afghans and their families that were promised visas and applied, and sometimes years ago never got them, and now have the Taliban at their back and a wall right in front of them. You know, the ability to go and actually do that and say, this is what's actually happening, and these are the people who are impacted, and this is what they have to say. Often that actually holds people to account, you know, in a way that really matters when it comes to foreign policy. So things like that, I mean, that goes on again and again and again, especially when it comes to war crimes. The ability to go in, look at records, interview families, and we've done this in Afghanistan when it comes to extrajudicial killings rather than arrests in Taliban-controlled areas. You know, especially when the NPR did some brilliant reporting on the levels of civilian casualties in Mosul during the airstrikes, some of the heaviest airstrikes, heaviest bombardments in modern day warfare to fight ISIS in Mosul, killed potentially tens of thousands of civilians. And it takes going in on the ground and interviewing people and doing the investigative reporting to prove things like that. So this is what in foreign reporting and in war reporting really holds people to account.
Great.
Yeah. And I think the veil is being lifted. Like, you know, I've seen reports recently where it almost feels like the reporters are doing PR for City Hall in certain instances. And, you know, it's very hard to get certain public officials on the record to sit down with you, mayors of major cities. They feel like they don't have to. I had a governor tell me once, we don't need to come, you know, just go back to, you know, how do we hold people to account? We have been reaching out to the governor's office via email, calling, like, can we talk to the governor about X, Y, and Z? We have questions. Just as a station, not just me as a reporter. So they told me to camp outside of his office. You know, they're like, he has to leave out that door. He has to go to his car, you know, and he came out, and I remember trying to get him to answer some questions. this is when I was working in television. And unfortunately, my camera person was like having issues with the camera, so I'm like waiting, like asking this questions over and over. This particular governor would say what was on his mind, which, you know, he would talk back, but it's like, I don't want to sit down and do an interview with you. One particular instance, you know, we kind of followed him out of the building, and his staffer was basically like just ripping me a new one, you know, like, how dare you, how dare you do your job. And he said, we don't have to even come to you anymore. We can just put out our message on Facebook.
Right.
So, you know,
So it's
in a way you have to, you know, you don't want to do like a gotcha. Like, nobody, like, I think they're human. Like, I know they're human,
You
right?
kind
Like,
of want to do it.
I mean, you want
I
to
want to do it.
I mean,
I
listen.
want you to do it.
I've done gotchas, you know. Like, I understand the humanity. Like, I know that they're in a position and they're beholden to the people, but I understand, like, as a human, what it might feel like to be bum rushed, right, or to feel that way. But at the same time, that's the only way to get.
Yeah.
You know, that's the only way. I had another governor who, you know, had a platform, won re-election on a certain issue, and I was doing a report on, you know, just some of the data that was out there that was kind of conflicting, you know, what he was saying on the campaign trail, and, you know, again, reaching out via email, and finally the governor's in town for a program that he wants to promote. And so after this program, I'm like, hey, to his staffer, you know, I'm the person who's been emailing you, because they kept saying, oh yeah, we'll definitely get it done. Months will go by, and so, you know, I'm asking him these questions about something that he ran on, and he could not even answer the questions, like factual, about like data, about like, you know, what were the trends in, on this issue, statistically speaking. You know, just looking around, you know, for someone to throw the answer out for him, and it just feels disingenuous sometimes, you know, as a reporter.
Well, it makes you realize that sometimes the enemies of democracy are inside the democracy.
Well, I think
the calls are coming from inside the house.
I think that for me, what it also spotlights and highlights is the people who don't get the shine, who don't get the perks of being in these positions, who probably aren't getting paid as well as they could, but are actually the ones crafting the legislation, or they're crafting the agenda. They know they're doing the research, right? You know, and then you have a figurehead who is just getting up and saying what they think is best in that moment.
Let's get some questions from the audience.
This comes from the point of view of a legacy journalist. I retired a decade ago after a career of foreign reporting in Europe and Asia. And is there a role for the kind of legacy journalism in your universe, or is it just a dinosaur?
Yeah.
Does it help you set standards? Do you have to read the New York Times and the Financial Times to keep balance? Does it have any role anymore?
Jane, you want to start, or Andrew, you want to start?
Go ahead.
Well, I thank you for your question, because I actually wanted to say that I think I got too excited about my ideas and maybe was sounding a bit absolutist, and like I think that there absolutely is. Like I think, I'm sorry. I said thank you for your question, and I'm actually really glad for it, because I'm afraid that perhaps I was sounding a bit absolutist about my ideas, and I'm just very excited about them. But I think there absolutely is a role for both approaches to journalism, and And I think if anything, like there's so much to learn from people like yourself who have this very deep practice, you know, after having confronted so many different situations, especially as a foreign reporter. I think that the peril is when you become so entrapped in an ideology or a paradigm, you think that's the only way to do something. So that's where I run into issues with some of my colleagues who are like, well, that's not journalism. It's like, well, can't both things be journalism? Like, can we make room for both inside of this tent? Just, you know, and so I think there is tons of potential for someone like yourself or someone who has equivalent experience to be able to impart very deep knowledge if we all come at this work with an open mind and an open heart and serious respect for one another, and how things can change sometimes.
One interesting thing about you know, legacy journalism and actual like respected institutions of journalism like the New York Times or the Washington Post or Wall Street Journal is that in this day and age where you're on Twitter and you read something someone has written, actually my gut reaction is it actually being reported by reputable news sources first? If I Google it and it's not in a reputable news source like that, then I will, you know, not retweet, and I certainly will take it as not reportable. And so that in and of itself shows that deep down in my DNA, I'm still respectful of specific brands, that I will see a brand like PBS or you know, NBC or New York Times, and I'll still think, well, there is a level of I know that there's within an institution like that, I know that there are specific channels that this has had to go through for some level of fact checking. Increasingly though, what I tend to do, and I think perhaps it was the same for you in your career, like in any newsroom, there'll be certain journalists who we think are brilliant and certain journalists who will be like, well, I'm not so sure about that one. And so I find that part of me more about the journalists themselves, for me, is becoming the brand. Not that I think journalists should be celebrities. I actually think, after all my years in TV, that is absolutely detrimental to quality reporting. But so I think that the legacy journalism absolutely does, you know, add a level of confidence and a certain degree of professionalism to the news in and of itself, because we know what it has had to go through to get there. But increasingly, I think it'll also be the journalists themselves and what their expertise is, and whichever organization they've worked for. Just one other point, though, on legacy journalism. Unfortunately, the conversation, as relevant as it is to talk about whether people want legacy journalism or not, right now, you know, looming in the background is the bigger elephant in the room, which is the economics. You know, can legacy journalism organizations survive? You know, is it a moot point to say, well, we like them, whenever they are really struggling to survive financially at all? And so I think, unfortunately, the economics might be more of a decider than, you know, what people want.
Yeah, I think to that point, you know, I actually, you know, I'm not anti-legacy media at all. I think the need for, you know, citizens journalism or, you know, just the need for more reporters in communities comes from the fact that the economics of the situation, newsrooms have shrank, and you know, you're relying on less reporters in a lot of these newsrooms to be everywhere at once. And you know, it's hard to get to everything. So I think that we need both. I think we need legacy, and I think that we need you know, any other, you know, form of media that can basically fill in the blanks, fill in the gaps.
Great.
Cliff, you wanted to close at 2:45. Do we have time for another question? It's Cliff's show.
So I think we have time for one more question, but yeah, just keep in mind we have 5 minutes. Yeah.
Is this on? Okay. My quick question is, I'd like to hear from each of you about covering the stakes and not the odds, as Jay Rosen puts it, which is, you know, the horse race is not useful for people, and what's on the line is.
That goes a little to your dignity point, I think.
Do you mean more kind of like like what makes it into the news because it's more important versus what's more popular, or do you mean in terms of the impact of those events on people? Sorry to ask you to clarify.
I mean that it's cheaper, easier, and more exciting to cover who's ahead
yes.
and who's losing and stuff like that
Yes.
versus democracy is on the line.
I have a quick observation on that is that certainly in television, you know, and in print you've also got the clickbait phenomenon, but in TV, obviously it was a lot easier to get the classic slow car chase became an infotainment, you know, closely followed by its ugly cousin, news you can use, which was kind of like, you know, which sunscreen should you be using today, which is all great, but it's, you know, a lot of people, and then of course celebrity news, which is just people talking. Well, it's cheap to do. It's so much cheaper than flying a team of people down to Brazil to cover the election. Or hiring a Brazilian team even to cover the election and send via satellite back their feeds, their videos, everything that they've done, get them hotels, fly them around the country. You know, reporting is expensive. But what we've seen is the response to that is even if you want to cover an event but you don't want to send a team, cable news has done the split screen, which is essentially, or the studio, where people love to be on TV, so they'll do it for free. People will show up just to talk in the studio, and that's free. But what we're seeing is that it's also very boring, and the ratings are tanking for good reason, because that's, you know, that's not that interesting. So I actually believe that, you know, people are kind of voting with their thumbs a little bit, and they're clicking on interesting videos in the field, you know, facts, reporting. So yeah, I think that trying to do it cheaply has failed and is continuing to fail.
Quick last word, each
Should
of you.
I jump in? Yeah. One of the things, or do you want to go?
No.
Yes, you do.
No. I was going to say something else, but no, please.
Okay. I just wanted to, you know, just to answer your question. One of the things that I enjoyed about my time working in the State House covering politics is that I got to cover issues, right? A bunch of different things. So one day I could be covering health-related issues, covering technology, and you know, I want to also like make the case for journalism is like good for you as a human. Like you're learning about the issues, you're actually like taking in information, and like you're able to make more informed decisions. I tried to focus on you know, the nuance of the issues, the meat of the issues, and not necessarily who wants to get it passed and why. I remember covering a story about insurance, and none of the lawmakers in the room knew anything about insurance, so I'm asking questions that, you know, like they wanted to change how the rates were calculated, and I'm asking legitimate questions about how insurance rates work, and also like, you know, there are loopholes that are going to be exploited in this. Like, what do you think about this? And they hadn't thought about it at all. So it's like that. You know, for me, that's where I think the reporting is. Instead of, you know, the odds, right? Like the stakes. Like, what is at stake if you pass this?
And that's back to holding power to account, asking good questions. Okay. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
What I wanted to ask was, if I cede my time, can we get one more question in? Otherwise, I'll answer the question.
Yeah,
Oh, no.
please.
Oh, answer.
Point is very important.
I'm
It's
sorry.
okay.
I was just, but I don't know what time it is. I'm sorry if I didn't like. If I need to like comment.
Well, the next panel starts at 3, and we have coffee and coffee.
Okay. So, did you all decide?
It's about gay teaching and abuse of power. Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm under a very serious racial attack. Donald Trump is trying to murder me. It sounds pretty out there, but that's what's happening. He has stolen my innovations, and he is using the IRS, the corrupt members of the IRS who he's working with, and he's also using the SPIA. They're laundering my business, and I am scrambling for my life every day. What's your take on that?
Well, so I can't comment on the specifics, but I really appreciate you kind of bringing that. I feel like this actually happens a lot, right? Where like news organizations are getting information from people and tips about things that are happening to them. And to kind of connect the 2 points and maybe answer both questions, like the state's question, like I think that oftentimes, especially in political reporting, what will happen is that not enough conversations are happening with people like yourself who are living, right? You said this when you were about like, oh, is it about democracy? It's about the fact that I can't make a living, right? And like, I feel like journalists need to be having more conversations with people like yourself to be able to really understand what the impacts of policies look like on the ground, what the impacts of what's being said in political races, and also trying to have conversations with people who are often not a part of the media ecosystem. But it's difficult, right? Like bridging that gap. So again, I can't comment on the specifics of what you were saying, but I feel like you bring up a good point by saying like, I have a voice, I want to be heard. How can I make it heard widely?
Okay, thanks, Andrew. That's great. We actually do have to stop now, though. Sorry, guys. Okay.